Welcome to the Probate Realtor Show, your one source for selling and buying real estate through trust and probate. Hear directly from the best attorneys and trusted advisors on how executors and administrators navigate the probate process in and out of court. Being a personal representative or successor trustee can be a daunting task, and often beneficiaries don't have a clear plan. Let us help you make the right decision for your clients, your family, and your legacy. And now, here's your host, the probate realtor himself, Matias Baker Masucci.
Welcome, everybody, to another very exciting episode of our show. Today, we are talking with Irene Blocksom. Irene, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matias. Nice to be on the show.
Yeah, of course. Irene is an attorney. She is an associate at Lagerlof. She specializes in probate administration, and estate planning, and she also services Japanese-speaking clients, which I think is pretty awesome. So let's delve right into it, Irene. We have a lot to go over, and I'm very excited to touch upon some of these things. The first question that I wanted to ask you, it's basically a very basic questions about somebody dear to a client has passed away, and they have no idea what to do. Where do they start?
Yeah. It's a rough time. You're notifying the family. Maybe you're notifying close friends, arranging for care for children or loved ones, your dogs or cats. Also, you have to find the will and trust documents. And sometimes you're like, where do I start? Two good places to start is maybe the safety deposit box. You could maybe see if there's an estate planning lawyer who drafted the will. And another thing that I think gets overlooked sometimes is make sure if there's a house where someone used to live and there's nobody in that house anymore, make sure it's secure. And I say this because I have some probate cases where there's squatters who moved in and took over, and they really threw a wrench into the whole probate process. So, assess the need for securing the house. And, make sure there's like a home insurance policy. I could go on and on, but I just wanted to highlight that.
This is what you're saying. That is awesome. Actually, we've never talked about that on the show, about the fact of securing a property that is vacant. That happens a lot. I see that a lot as a real estate agent. There are squatters, there are people who break in, et cetera, et cetera. Changes depending on the neighborhood, but in LA, it's a risk pretty much anywhere. So making sure that the property is secure is very, very important. And there's actually companies that will board up the property secure if it's needed, if that is needed. So yeah, that's very good to know. And something that I also advise people that have vacant homes, might as well share that with the audience. Now you can get Wi-Fi internet without having a cable connection. You just get those boxes that have Wi-Fi, so you could buy a Ring camera and connect it to your phone, and a Ring alarm, which costs you like $300, and put it on, because it does work as a deterrent. And if somebody opens the door, it goes right to your phone, even if you don't reside, especially if you don't reside in the area. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's an opportunity to give some good tips to our audience. Now let's talk about after somebody passes away and the process starts of finding a probate. I mean, horror stories of people that try to do it on their own. But you as an attorney, when that happens, I guess you enter into the realm of probate administration. So I wanted to talk to you about what is that?
Yeah. So, probate administration, it's the court process that you have to go through to, distribute assets or validate a will. And in California specifically, this happens when you don't have a properly set up living trust, not a will, but a trust. And your assets are over the threshold of, right now it's 184,500. And this even includes life insurance policies.
Which is pretty much anybody. If you own a piece of real estate in LA County, you are going to probate.
Exactly. And if you have real property and it's above 60,000, also probate. But I don't know any properties on this country that are below that threshold. So that's what triggers, the probate process. But, there's a person that gets appointed to kind of administer the estate. There's creditors you have to take care of, the taxes, all the fun stuff. You have to figure out what to do with the house, the car, and everything has to be kind of supervised by the court throughout the whole process. And you can expect, a very efficient probate to wrap up taking a whole year.
Right.
That's pretty typical for California for the whole, probate process.
That makes total sense. Now,
Yeah.
there, like you said, there are notices, there are things to do. I have worked with people who attempt to do probate on their own, which I always say, please don't do it. Contact an attorney, because every time you have to do something that involves the courts, you do want somebody who is familiar with the process. And so, what I wanted to talk to you about, like, as a client of yours, so somebody who would come to you, so do you explain to them the timeline and sort of say, like, we have to do this within this time, and then this happens, and then this happens? How do you kind of go about educating your clients about probate?
That's a great idea. I think if you dump everything on them at the first meeting, that's probably not the best approach.
Right. Yeah.
I like to start off with a timeline just so they kind of have an understanding. Okay, so once we prepare the documents, like LA County, for instance, it'll take like 60 days for them to set up the date. Then you'll get appointed, and there'll be this like 4-month process where we absolutely, can't close down probate after you get your letter. So I give them an idea of that. I usually go into depth after they've been appointed, and I'll tell them here, I give them a checklist. I'm like a checklist person. So I'm like, here's your checklist of things to do. And like, call me if you have any questions. And I like to go step by step. Sometimes people go way out there, like, my sister died last week, and what's an accounting and what's wrong? And I'm like, let's do it one step at a time. Like, we'll address each thing as it comes, one day at a time.
That makes total sense. That makes total sense. Let's talk about the difference between trust administration and probate administration.
Yeah. So, trust administration, that happens when there's a trust. So as long as a trust is, set up properly, trust administration is not supervised by the court, which means it's private, as opposed to probate, where everything's public. Even the will becomes public. Usually when the person who set up the trust, called the settlor, passes away, the successor trustee takes over and pretty much has to follow the instructions of the trust, kind of distribute the assets. So in doing that, my advice for, if you're looking for an attorney to set up your living trust, make sure they're not just, here's your documents, like, goodbye. Make sure that you can trust them to like maintain that long-term relationship with your successor trustee as well, because trust administration is simpler than probate, but there's still requirements like signing notices, sometimes accountings, tax filings. There's a lot of things required to do. So it's just kind of important to be kind of picky when you're going through the process of picking your estate planning attorney.
That makes total sense. Thank you. Now, we know death is an emotional, there's an emotional component to it. People have even a difficult time talking about it. So obviously, as you are providing legal support, there's also an aspect of emotional support. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about, how do you strike a balance between the emotional support needs of a client and their legal support?
First off, when the potential client calls, I kind of figure out like when did they pass away, and do they have the time to process? They're like, oh, my sister and best friend died last Tuesday. Like, please take care of the funeral, like the burial process, like spend time with your loved ones before you dive in, because once you dive in, there's a lot of work to be done. And another thing is too, my clients, they're dealing with grief and loss, and they're going through trauma, and I have to recognize that. And people deal with trauma differently.
Of course.
Some people have they appreciate to-do lists, and they're like, I'm going to deal with this by doing all these things, checking off the list. Other people are just frozen. They need hand-holding. They need more time to process. So I feel like kind of tailoring your communication depending on what their response is important.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the financial aspect of probate. I think this is a very important thing that scares a lot of people, frankly. So if somebody's advised, look, it's time to open probate, I guess the first question they may think is like, oh my God, how am I going to be able to afford an attorney? How am I going to be able to afford a probate attorney? And what does the fee structure look like? what kind of transparency is there? So can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
So, the good news is like it's not going to be, it's usually not coming straight out of your wallet, although you might have to upfront a little bit. It all comes from the estate. So even if, let's say there's $1 million house in the estate, once the house is sold, it comes from the proceeds of the house. So you're not having to foot this big bill. But the statutory fee, just to give you an idea about how much it is, like for $1 million estate, it's $27,000 coming off the top for the attorney's fee. And interestingly enough, the personal representative is also entitled to the same amount. So 27 and 27. If you don't want to do that job, just know that there's that chunk getting taken off of the estate. It is expensive. But
we know people work with professional fiduciaries in addition to an attorney. So if they appoint a neutral third party sometimes, especially if there's litigation involved. So that makes total sense.
Yeah. And one thing too, I hope this like rarely happens, but attorneys actually aren't allowed to charge hourly fees until the court approves everything. It's like at the very end. So if you have an attorney that's like sending you a monthly bill, there's something, and I'm not talking about costs. They can file they can bill you for court filing fees and things like that. But hourly fees absolutely have to wait until the court approves every single thing. It's very regulated. So just keep an eye out for that.
That makes sense. Thank you for that advice. Now, let's talk about the DIY kind of approach to probate and why that is not a good idea. So I guess my question is, why shouldn't someone administer their loved one's probate?
Yeah. I actually have some probates where they attempted to do DIY or gave up. There's just, the paperwork is so complicated. The amount of notices you have to send out to everyone. Like, for example, you're even required to send notice to the witnesses of a will and estranged family members, people who are disinherited. We can help with that. We can hire a private investigator, track them down. There's all these things that go into probate, and the forms are very complicated. And so I strongly recommend working with an attorney. And I'm you can try, but when I go to my probate hearings, I sometimes see, and it breaks my heart too. There's people that are talking to the judge, and they've been administering someone's probate for years. And it's did you look at the probate notes? And they're I don't know what that is. And I was
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So maybe DIY.
Yeah. One of the things that, actually, it's funny you say that, because I'm going to go on a kind of a slight tangent here. When people try to do it themselves, and like you said, and then they decide, okay, this is too much for me, and then they reach out to you. I wanted to ask you, do you find it more difficult when people have already started rather than you having overseen from the beginning? When you have to clean up messes on the other hand, do you know what I'm saying?
I actually have a client who attempted their own one, and there were, a whole page list of things to fix, but it's not too hard to fix something if it's just a couple things they forgot to do or mistaken, because we can easily fix that. But it is more unfortunate, I will say, if there's an attorney who doesn't know what they're doing, or if they make some filings that really mess up the probate process. That's really, really hard to fix and unravel and undo. So if for example, a mistaken inventory is filed, we have to file a correction, and the list can go on and on. So yeah, I think it does take more work usually to unwind something.
That makes sense. Now, when it comes to probate, people often hear the word bond. You have to post a bond for this, post a bond, et cetera, et cetera. Let's increase the bond amount to this. Can you tell us why a bond, what is it, and why is it needed?
Yeah. So you've probably heard of bail bonds. I like to describe it kind of as a insurance policy for the estate. So it's a contract between the bond company and the court. So let's just imagine that, Sally. She's a bad executive, and she takes off with $1 million from her grandma's estate and runs away to Mexico or something. So if Sally had a smart attorney, or if the judge required it, and there was a bond in place, the bond would cover that loss.
Right.
And the thing about the bond, which makes it actually really important for law firms too, is even the law firm can be liable for the loss. So it's very important. Occasionally we can waive bond. So if there's a will and the will says waive bond, occasionally we will, but even the judge can make that decision too, if they think it's necessary.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Now, when somebody dies, all of us, we all have credit card bills, we have our, life insurance, whatever these bills may be, that we have every month. Is the estate responsible to pay for those bills? Number one. And number two, how do I know if any of these creditors are legitimate? Like, when you let creditors know, some people may come out of the woodwork and you never heard of them.
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of my clients have, a mountain of bills too, and they're like, oh my gosh, like, where do I start? And a lot of my clients, my conscientious clients, they're like shocked when I'm like, oh, don't worry about them for now. A lot of them, it's not necessary to pay for right away. I like to think of like debts in like different categories. Taxes are the like must pay category, and they have to be paid first. And then mortgages, it just really depends on the situation. Those are very important. You have to monitor. You don't want your property to go into foreclosure. And then there's the third category, which is like unsecured claims, like credit card bills, hospital bills, and shopping bills, whatever it is.
Right.
Now, for those bills to actually be payable, the creditors are required to file a creditor claim to the court, and they're required to provide proof of the debt. They can't just say like, oh, this is $1,000 random company name. They have to provide proof. So I often advise my clients, I'm like, do you recognize this debt? And then, is this enough proof? I work with the client to like figure that out. But if the creditors never end up filing the creditor claim, and then it's the later of 4 months after letters are issued, or 60 days after the creditors are notified. So the debt disappears. So if your mom had a shopping problem and there's a bunch of bills, give it to your attorney first, and then we'll take care of the notices, and then we'll let you know if you have to pay that or not.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about you. Let's talk about your journey. This is always one of the questions that I like to ask. Did you want to be an attorney when you were a kid?
I do get this question sometimes. I wanted to be an attorney probably more so after college.
Okay.
I worked I grew up in Japan, born and raised in Japan, until I was 18 or so, and then moved to the US, and I was working for a Japanese company, and I was, working in that environment, and I just saw how, I was working in like the human resources department. So I really saw how the law worked, and I got to know more about the law, and I was realizing, okay, well, there's some things that like this company is not following, and like some of my associates, colleagues are actually being treated in an illegal way, and I was like, I can't do anything without a degree, so I started to apply for law school.
That's great. So a crusader for the little guy. I love that. And now let's talk about the area of law that you ended up practicing, because I know that, in law school, obviously, criminal law, family law, you don't really, a lot of the people that I talk to, when they go to law school, they don't necessarily know what type of lawyers they're going to be when they graduate. When did you know that probate and estate planning was something of interest to you?
That's a great question. I thought about this a lot. There's a lot of people like, criminal law is glamorous, or want to be a litigator. Actually, this is like a personal experience, but my grandmother, she had dementia, and unfortunately, and she didn't have a will in place, and during that process, they had to send her figure out an elder care home, a nursing home, and it was really, really difficult on the whole family.
Mhm.
And people just had different ideas about what's the best way to help her. How do we deal with it? And it just really, really caused such a big problem. And I was like, oh man, like if they had a will in place, all of this could have been prevented, and
Right.
it would have kept the family like peaceful. And so that really made me interested in kind of like helping out families with like estate planning and also probate as well.
Thank you. That makes total sense. Great. Now, before I let you go, I like to end with a little bit of the back of the business card. So I have a list of questions. I want please pick a number between 1 and 30.
4.
4. Okay. It's a good question. What are you passionate about?
I'm a huge music person. I grew up like playing piano and like singing for like church, and so that's kind of like ingrained in me. So that's something I like to do on the weekends, and it's just like a little side hobby thing, but it's something that I really love to do.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what is the best way for our audience to get a hold of you?
They can contact me at my email address. It's iblocksom@lagerlof.com. My name is Irene Blocksom. You can contact, Lagerlof Law. If you just look up Lagerlof, we're the biggest firm in Pasadena, and I'm happy to talk.
That's great. You know what I think, Irene? I think there are not enough people named Irene in the world. I mean, I'm just saying that. It's completely out of the
More
blue.
of an old person's name.
Yeah, but it's a good name. It's a good name. I want to thank you so much for doing this. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks everybody who has joined us for this episode, and we will see you on the next episode. Bye.
Thank you so much, Matias.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to the Probate Realtor Show. Find more episodes and interact with us at probaterealtor.la. That's probaterealtor.la. Listen, ask questions, and get results. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The Probate Realtor Matias Baker Masucci is a licensed real estate broker in California, DRE number 020544763. Any legal information provided is for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. Contact an attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular legal issue or problem. We make no guarantees as to the accuracy of any information. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.